Cynthia Ann Parker is probably the most well-known Comanche captive. She was captured on May 19, 1836, east of Waco, Texas, near the small town of Groesbeck. This was nearly 1 month after the victory of the Texans at San Jacinto, but the attack on Fort Parker was just one of many Comanche raids that occurred during the spring of 1836. While Santa Anna was conducting his war of extermination against the Texans, Comanches were raiding both American and Spanish settlements. In this episode, we will hear about an attack on the Dolores settlements in early April of 1836. This settlement was all the way down near the Rio Grande, about 30 miles north of Eagle Pass, Texas. We will be reading from this book, a narrative of the captivity of Sarah Horn and her 2 children with Mrs. Harris by the Comanche Indians. This book was written by Sarah Horn along with editor E. House, all the way back in 1839. Here is her story. I was born in the town of Huntingdon, about 60 miles north of the city of London, England, of poor but pious parents, of the name of Newton. My father died when I was 3 years of age, leaving my mother a widow of 10 children, of whom I was the youngest. We were all of us children brought up strictly to habits of industry, under the fostering care of our mother, under whose guidance and protection by a superintending providence, in connection with the kind efforts of my eldest brother, we were respectably raised to a state of maturity. Our dear mother taught us at an early period in life the principles and practice of our holy religion, and to her precepts and examples in connection with the operations of the Holy Spirit upon my heart, I attribute the sustaining grace, which alone could have supported me through the painful vicissitudes of the eventful history I am about to record. My early life furnishes little, in addition to the above, out of the ordinary course, though in my isolated condition, a comparison between my early and later history wrings my heart with indescribable sensations. At the age of 18, I was united in the bands of holy wedlock of Mr. John Horn, on the 14th day of October, 1827, at St. James Church, Clerkenwell, London. My lamented husband proved to be all that my fond heart had anticipated, and under God and him centered my fondest hopes. We settled in Islington No. 2, Moon, St. Gilsum Square, London. My husband was well established in the mercantile business in a small way, and here I spent the first and happiest part of my wedded life, in the society of my dear mother, who lived with me till her death, which took place about 3 years after my marriage. She died in great peace of mind on her birthday, aged 66 years. On the afternoon of the day of her death, and about an hour before that event, she called me to her bedside, and expressed the most triumphant anticipations as to her future state, and manifested the most tender solicitude for the well-being of my 2 little sons, the youngest of whom, 16 months old, I held in my arms at the time. My eldest was 15 months older, John and Joseph. The public mind at that time was a good deal agitated with the idea of emigrating to America, to better their condition in life, and among the rest my husband made up his mind to emigrate. He was at first desirous of leaving me and our little ones behind, till he should cross the water and seek a home for our future residence. But as I had liberty of a choice, I could not, without a painful sacrifice of feeling, consent to be left behind, and the state of my health was such that it was thought that to cross the water might be of service to me. We concluded therefore to bid farewell to our friends, and seek a home in the New World. Having settled our affairs on the 20th of July, 1833, we set sail in the ship Samuel Robinson, Captain Criswald, bound for New York. We had a pleasant passage and arrived at our port of destination on the 27th of August, all well and my health much improved. We took a residence in the city, I think, at 237 Madison Street. My husband concluded to spend some time in this place, that he might be enabled to look about and make up his mind as to his future movements with reference to a permanent home. He soon obtained a clerkship in a respectable house kept by Mr. John McKibben, and here we remained till November 1834. About this time there was much said in the public prints, and otherwise concerning the new Republic of Texas, and great inducements were held out to obtain settlers in that country. A Dr. Beals of New York was much interested in raising a colony to settle on the Rio Grande, in order to secure a title to a large tract of land which it appeared, if not settled by such a time, was to revert back to the government, and as an inducement to settlers they were offered 137 acres of land and a town lot to build on. Let it be observed the colony was to be planted on the Rio Grande, Big River, and also that this in that direction was the extreme point of safety from the Indians. Whatever may be the views of many with regard to a superintending providence, I think it proper in this place to state something of my feelings with regard to our going to Texas, in connection with circumstances which occurred on the eve of our starting for that place. From the first time the subject was talked of, and notwithstanding all the fortitude I could command, my mind was a constant prey to the most distressing apprehensions. An undefinable sense of affliction seemed constantly to haunt my imagination, and in order to quiet my feelings, my kind husband offered to procure me a passage back to England, to remain with my friends until he should fix upon a permanent home, and then come and take me to it. But to this kind proposal I was reluctant to consent. I felt that he was my greatest earthly treasure, and that if there were dangers in his path, it accorded with the feelings of the heart I had given him with my hands, to share them with him, and with his consent I made up my mind accordingly. Previous to leaving New York, I dreamed 3 nights out of 4 that I was greatly distressed with the care of 2 infant children, which by some means unknown to me, were confided to my protection. I cannot recognize them as my own. I thought them very beautiful. They gave me a great deal of painful anxiety, but I could get no one to assist me in my charge. At length I thought I saw 2 of my sisters, Mary and Eliza, and I called on the latter to assist me to take care of the babes. But without seeming to notice me, she turned away from me, saying that they were mine, and that I must take care of them myself. I then called on my sister Mary, and she also gave me the same answer. On looking around, I discovered a small bed in a corner, upon which I laid one of my children, and while doing so I thought it the most beautiful creature I had ever beheld. I then took up the other and nursed it from my right breast, and while it was still at the breast, I went to the bed to look after the one which I had laid down, and its beauty had departed. It appeared naked and extremely filthy, as though it had been dead some time. The other was still nursing upon my right breast, and the milk was flowing in such abundance from my left as to cause a dreadful chill throughout my whole frame, with which I awoke. Such a dream, and repeated 3 nights out of 4 so circumstantially, to say the least, was very singular. There were a number of circumstances at the time of our leaving the city, which if not indeed ominous, but too well accorded with the feelings of my heart, whenever I contemplated a settlement in Texas. The first load of furniture we sent to the battery to be shipped on board the vessel, the horse took fright, ran furiously, and did much injury to the goods and himself, an occurrence that was unaccounted for by his owner, and quite singular to those acquainted with the animal. The next day we sent another load, when a tremendous fall of rain came on with terrible thunder and lightning, and the poor horse broke through the dock, the first occurrence of the kind, and it was with much difficulty that he was saved, being badly injured. I had also a favorable article of furniture destroyed. Our arrangements being completed, we set sail for the land of promise on the 11th of November, 1834, in the schooner Amos Wright, Captain Monroe, and instead of arriving at Texas as we had been told we should, in 20 or 30 days, we were about 5 weeks in getting to Capano, and then we were about 2 months and a half travel from the place of our destination. Before we could proceed further, we had to procure ox teams from a distance of 50 miles. This, with other preparations, consumed the time from the 16th of December to the 1st of January, during which interval a large company of us spent our time in tents, and fared very well upon game and fish, with which the land and water abounded. On the 1st of January we had got all things in readiness, and started for the Rio Grande. We had a large company destined for the same place, who were from different parts of the world. We had proceeded but a short distance when the wagon in which I was placed with my children broke down. I was then placed in another, and at a few yards from the first, the second broke under me, when I was removed to a pleasure carriage which in a short distance also broke, so that it could be got no further, and all this occurred within the distance of 1 mile. From the disasters above related, they called me the unlucky woman. We traveled about 2 miles the first day, One half the distance I rode on horseback, and 2 gentlemen carried my children, as my husband had to remain with the wagons. We had to go this distance to obtain wood and water. It took the next and a part of the following day to repair the wagons. In the after part of the day we traveled about 3 miles, crossed the river Luna, and encamped for the night. The next day we made 6 miles, which brought us to a settlement called Austin's Colony, and here we encamped 2 days. This was a very unhealthy place, settled mostly with Irish, numbers of whom died with ague and fever. They endeavored to persuade us to go no further, and to settle with them, alleging that if we went further the Indians would kill and eat us. On the afternoon of the day of our arrival at this place, 4 of the men of our company went out to hunt, and their not returning at dark alarmed us very much. We had fires burning, and a large bell hung upon a tree and rung all night. The next morning, however, they came in all safe, having lost their way. From this place we traveled slowly until we came to a settlement about 40 miles distant, called La Piedad, composed solely of Spanish people, who had never seen an Englishwoman. Our appearance among them excited great curiosity, and crowds of them flocked to gaze at our persons. These people also warned us not to venture further into the interior, for fear of the Indians. They gave us to understand that various parties of them were constantly on the watch to surprise and take the unwary traveler. From La Piedad we proceeded to Bahia, where we remained about 2 weeks. Our teams were worn down, and we were obliged to procure others. To this people also we were a new thing under the sun, they never having seen any English females before. They were permitted to indulge their curiosity from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening, and then were made to retire, for fear that they might be disposed to indulge their propensity to plunder, for which it seems they have a great inclination. We had to keep strict watch every night for fear of Indians, and the Spaniards we regarded as very little better. We crossed the river from this place into San Antonio, about 5 miles from which place we came to the spot where the unfortunate Mr. Smith, a gentleman from the United States, had been attacked by a party of Indians, and lay by the roadside weltering in his blood. One of his Spanish guides had been killed in the struggle, and 2 more were so badly wounded that they were barely able to crawl to San Antonio and inform the people of the melancholy affair. Dr. Beals, to whose colony we were going, and who traveled with us, gave him every assistance in his power, both as a physician and friend. Poor Mr. Smith, though much exhausted by the dreadful struggle and the loss of blood, was still able to converse, and gave us an account of the whole affair. He and his 3 Spanish guides had fought for their lives against vastly superior numbers of Indians for about 3 hours. One of his guides was killed on the ground, and the 2 others were perhaps mortally wounded. The doctor extracted a number of balls and slugs from the body of the sufferer, and having dressed his wounds, sent him to San Antonio, where I afterwards learned he died. The horrible scene just related, but too well accorded with the forebodings of my heart. I felt indeed as though I was hastening onward, if not to death itself, to some indefinite scene of misery, the anticipation of which is only second to the reality. I looked upon my dear husband and our sweet little babes with feelings which none but an anxious mother's heart can fully realize. At the distance of about 30 miles we came to Presidio, at which place we stayed several days. The Spaniards here were very kind to us. They were much employed in fishing in the Rio Grande, upon the margin of which some of our young men discovered and killed a large bear. It was very fat, though it had 3 young ones, which the men caught and tamed. I preserved some of the oil in small empty bottles I had with me, but I little knew to whose use it could be applied. We were now near the spot where the colony expected to settle, but by some means the place of our location was changed, and we had to go 30 miles further into a wilderness, infested with savages. The Spaniards whom we had employed to conduct us thus far were so fearful of the Indians that they would not cross the river, nor could they be induced to permit their teams to do so. By this means we were under the necessity of sending a part of our goods at a time, and a part of the company had to go with the teams, and a part to stay behind, till the others should go and return. But in a divided situation we were too much exposed to the Indians, and we had to send a number of our company back with the returning Spaniards to San Fernando, and not being able to procure government troops, they raised a company of volunteers. These, some 50 or 60 in all, were divided. A part went to guard the teams, and the rest stayed with us who were left until they returned. Our men caught an abundance of excellent fish from the river, but in this employment my husband came near losing his life, and was only saved from a watery grave by the timely aid of one of our soldiers, and but for which he might have been spared the cruel death which awaited him. Our teams returned in about 2 weeks. The rest of us set out and arrived on the 16th of March, at the place of our destination, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Our men selected a spot for safety from the Indians, in the midst of a thicket, and having cut out the brush, commenced erecting our tents. The day had been pleasant with a little brisk wind, but at this time it had become cloudy, and before our tents were completed, it began to rain moderately, which soon increased to a torrent. Before the sun was set, it was so dark that we could scarcely see to do anything. The thunder and lightning, with the dreadful wind and rain, was altogether awful indeed. My husband had as much as he could do to keep our frail habitation erect. Indeed, it was blown down once or twice, and it was all we could do to re-establish it. I stood nearly the whole of that fearful night ankle-deep in water, and held bedclothes over our babes, to screen them as much as possible from the raging elements. But he who maketh a way for the lightning of the thunder preserved us in safety, and by his inscrutable but just providence reserved my dear family for a more dreadful fate. Near this spot our cabins were built in the following manner. Our men, about 40 in number, cut away from the brush in the center of a large thicket, and piled it up so as to form an almost impassable hedge around a space sufficiently large to contain our dwellings. This precaution was to guard them against the Indians. In these rude habitations we remained during our stay in the colony, and near to which each man selected a piece of ground on which to plant his crop. But we could obtain little or nothing from the soil without irrigating it, and after the most unwearied toil, our incessant labor was repaid with a meager harvest. The ground in many places was literally covered with salt. We dug a number of wells, but the water for domestic use had to be brought about half a mile. The soldiers continued to be our guard by night and by day, during our stay at this place. Our cornbread cost us from 3 4/2 to $4 for a Spanish measure of about 1.5 bushels. Our coffee $1 per pound. Sugar could be had at San Fernando by the barrel for 6 1/4 cents. We remained in this place from the 16th of March to the 8th of March following. From April to September the heat was so intense that we were obliged to keep within doors every day from 12 to 3 o'clock, and the flies and mosquitoes were continually distressing us as soon as the evening shades came on. The whole colony were at one time alarmed for the fate of a little boy, about 7 years old, who had the care of some goats while his elder brother came in to breakfast. On his return the little one could not be found, and for 2 days and nights in succession the soldiers and all who could be spared were on the search. Our great bell was taken out and hung on a tree, and rung night and day, but one fearful apprehension chiefly prevailed, and that was that he had fallen into the hands of the Indians. The poor mother was frantic with grief. All our searching, however, was fruitless, and after having been out and lost for 2 days and nights, the little creature struck the path which brought him home. The joy was general, but that of his almost distracted parents, and especially that of his mother, cannot be written. Truly, the mother's heart, doubled in wedlock, multiplied in children, stands but the broader mark for all the mischiefs that rove promiscuously abroad, and widens and dilates to wide dimensions its sad capacity of pain. We learned from gentlemen that the cruel disappointment we had sustained in not obtaining our location according to promise, and in being taken into the wilderness 30 miles, where we were increasingly exposed to the arms of a savage foe, was thereby to induce a more speedy settlement, and increase the price of the land. We had been told that the soil would repay the husbandman with 2 rich crops in the year, but after all our toil we could not even get one that deserved the name. We had also been told that the Rio Grande was navigable, so as to answer the ends of commerce, but this was equally unfounded in fact, and it was ascertained satisfactorily that art could not make it so. These things, in connection with the danger of our being murdered by savages, without a moment's warning, induced some of our friends to leave the colony. Among those who left were 4 families and a number of young men. Myself and my eldest child were sick at this time with ague and fever, or we should have left with them. About this time a circumstance occurred which, though somewhat ludicrous in its origin, was in the issue of a serious moment. A young man of our colony had manifested great courage with regard to the Indians, and boasted much of what he would do in the case of an assault. He kept 2 guns loaded by him almost wherever he went. A number of men with the wife of one of them entered secretly into a plot to test his courage. They had taken the precaution to load his guns with powder only, and in the morning he took them as usual, and went to a creek some distance off to fish. The 5 men then disguised themselves and soon discovered themselves to him in the bushes, as though they were endeavoring to keep out of his sight, upon which he was so much alarmed that instead of discharging his guns, he set out to jump across the creek, and nearly ruined one of them, falling in about the midst of the stream. The noise soon reached the camp, and as none of us except the woman above mentioned knew anything of the cause of the alarm, we were all dreadfully frightened. Strange as it may appear, the woman who knew all about it was loudest in her exclamations, expressing her great fears that the Indians had killed them. We were, however, soon let in on the secret, but from that hour the poor young man was ruined. He never afterwards seemed to be himself while we remained together, and I afterwards learned that he went wholly beside himself, and deeply did I deplore his misfortune. On our way to this place, we had been under the necessity of leaving some of our provisions in the mission house belonging to the Catholics at Austin's colony, and when we sent for them, we were informed that they had been stolen, and we never got them. Little else but a series of misfortunes and disappointments had attended us from the moment we set out for this strange land. The soil was so indifferent, and there were so many embarrassments in the way, that my husband did not think the 137 acres of the Bounty land worth the cost of survey, and he never located it. About this time a scene of savage barbarity occurred about 40 miles from us, which tended greatly to enhance the darkness of the gloom that pervaded my troubled mind. There was at the place a farm improved by a company of men. There were 7 in number, 2 of whom had left for the settlements in the afternoon, when a party of the Comanche Indians came to the house, and asked for a sheep for their supper, which was granted them. In the morning they returned, and asked for another, which was refused them. They then commenced the work of death, and in a few moments the 5 men and a boy lay dead, as they supposed upon the ground. They took off the scalps of the 6 men from the head as low down to the ears, and having collected what plunder they could, they departed. The next day the 2 men returned, and having seen what was done, they set out immediately in quest of assistance with which to pursue the foe. On the same evening they returned with a company of soldiers, when it was discovered that one of the men was still alive, though shockingly mangled. His sufferings must have been indescribable, having remained upon his face his bare skull exposed by day to the heat of a burning sun, and otherwise dreadfully wounded. They took him to San Fernando, 20 miles, where, with the loss of an arm which was amputated, he recovered. He said that the savage who took his scalp, after he had made the incision round his head, stood upon his shoulders and tore it from him as he would skin from a slaughtered sheep. This intelligence served to hasten us in our deliberations, and we made up our minds to get to Matamoras, and sail for England as soon as possible. But the route from where we were to any harbor was fraught with danger from the savage foe. No one thought of undertaking the hazardous enterprise alone. We therefore made up a company of 11 men, only 2 of whom had families, a Mr. Harris and my dear husband. At this time the bloody Santa Anna was ravaging the country with fire and sword, and was no less a terror to us than the Indians. He was carrying on a war of extermination against the Americans, and in order to keep out of his way, by being now quite near us, we took a circuitous route and went to San Patricio. For several days we traveled without any road. The first day we proceeded about 8 miles, and encamped for the night, where the cries of the wild animals but too well accorded with the awful sensations which crowded my anxious mind. Thousands of miles from the land of my birth, thwarted at every step in our endeavors to find a home for ourselves and little ones, in a strange land, the theater of blood and carnage, my poor heart sunk almost within me. But hitherto the good being had protected me, and I tried to commend myself and family still to his fatherly protection. The next day we progressed in safety, but quite slowly, procuring plenty of game for our subsistence. On the 3rd day a wheel of one of our wagons gave way, and we were detained some time in repairing it. We then proceeded on until we came to Rio Nueces. Here we stopped several days to recruit our oxen. By the side of this river we came into the road leading to San Patricio. Both before and after we came into this road, we could distinctly hear the guns of Santa Anna's men in pursuit of their game for meats, and the voices of the men as they were driving their teams. On the margin of this river we saw plenty of buffalo and wild horses. The latter were the most beautiful creatures I ever beheld. As they approached the river to drink, the dams with their little sprightly colts were an interesting sight. We left the river the 2nd day of April, and made some 10 or 12 miles and then encamped for the night. The next day we traveled as usual, and on the 4th started quite early, in order to reach a large lake which was said to contain an abundance of excellent fish, and where it was stated that some Americans had recently killed an alligator. We arrived at the fatal spot about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It should have been stated before that Mrs. Harris, the only female companion I had with me, was of feeble health, with a babe about 3 months old, and very much afflicted with broken breasts, in consequence of which her babe, a sweet little girl, was almost constantly in my arms. We had turned out the teams to feed. Some of the men were cooking dinner from a fine deer, and some were fishing, and others fixing their guns and reading. Mrs. Harris was a short distance off gathering some wild fruits, and my husband was sitting on the ground near me with our little sons. He had got some teeth of the alligator, and was making holes through them with the gimblets, in order to suspend them about the necks of the children to please them. I had just washed Mrs. Harris's babe, and as I was stepping up on the fore part of the wagon to get a clean dress to put on it, I saw a large company of strange-looking men mounted on mules, armed and nearly naked. I was terribly frightened, and running back to my husband as soon as possible told him what I had seen, and expressed my fears that they were Indians. He looked up in my face, and smiling, said he thought there could be no danger, and wished me to dress the babe that I held naked in my arms. But while he was speaking, the Indians came in sight, and the work of death commenced. The first thing I perceived, an arrow had found its way into the breast of one of our men standing by my side. He drew it out with his own hands, when the blood flowed in a stream, and he fell on his face and expired. By this time our little company was falling in every direction. I flew to my husband, who was standing a short distance from me with our children, one on each side, holding them by the hands. I still had Mrs. Harris's babe in my arms. She, being a short distance off, and dreadfully frightened, had hid herself in the bushes. As I approached my husband, I caught hold of my little Joseph by the hand, and by this time the Indians were in the midst of us. They instantly tore me and my children from my dear husband, when one of the savages struck him on the back of his head with a double-barreled gun, and he fell to the ground upon his face. I saw him draw his arms up under him and raise his head once from the ground, when he uttered a deep sigh, and the mortal agony was past with him forever. My children were much frightened, as well may be supposed, but neither they nor their wretched mother were permitted to linger near the scene of their murdered father, as the Indians immediately conducted us to the wagon. By this time they had found Mrs. Harris, and led her also to the same spot, where I gave her her babe. My dear little children were frantic with grief and fear, while I was endeavoring, in my distracted condition, to do all I could to console them, but the savages took every precaution to prevent me from doing so. They immediately tore the little trembling creatures from me, and producing their instruments of death, showed them by signs the most appalling that they would kill them if they went near me. There were between 40 and 50 of the Indians, but these were but a small part of the whole band, as will shortly appear. Having thrown everything out of the wagon, they selected such things as they were disposed to take away at this time. They then placed myself and Mrs. Harris behind 2 of the party on horseback, she having her babe in her arms, and 2 of the men took charge of my children. Thus arranged, we left the spot, where in one short moment we had buried our fondest earthly hopes, and what was to be of my fate, or that of my dear children, I was utterly at a loss even to conjecture. And but for my orphan babes, my heart had been almost insensible to life or death. As we could not understand a word of the language of our captors, so we were unable to learn where they were going, or what disposition was to be made of us. We soon learned, however, that their camp was only about 2 miles from the place where they found us, and when we got within about a quarter of a mile of the spot, a scene presented itself that defies all description. We were met by several hundred of their companions, in files of 6 or 8 abreast, who, with the most horrid yells, and varied contortions of body and limbs, expressed their barbarous joy. We were soon conducted to the camp, which was formed in the midst of an almost impenetrable thicket, for the purpose of concealment. Having reached this dreadful place, we were almost suffocated with the stench arising from the stale horse meat which lay in and about the camp. Here we were seated on the ground under a guard, when they commenced stripping us of our bonnets, handkerchiefs, combs, and rings. They took everything from my children, leaving them as naked as they were born. Mrs. Harris's babe, the reader will recollect, was naked in my arms at the time that we were taken, and so it remained, although I begged them to let me put a blanket on it before we left the scene of conflict, which they would not permit. By this time night was coming on, when the Indians partook of the offensive meat of which I have spoken, but they offered neither us nor our children a morsel of anything, though they had plenty of provisions of which they had plundered us, nor did they ever permit us or our children to taste of it. Before they laid down for the night, Mrs. Harris and myself were bound by passing a cord about our ankles and arms, so as to bring the latter close to our sides. In this condition we were placed upon the naked ground, with a blanket thrown over us, and the whole of that dreadful night my agonized heart seemed ready to burst, as I listened to the cries of my orphan babes, as they called for their murdered father, and for water to quench their thirst. And as though my cup of anguish was not otherwise complete, the mosquitoes of enormous size were annoying me at every point, without the use of a single limb with which to defend myself. It is infinitely beyond the power of language to express the horrors of this painfully memorable night. The babe lay quiet till near daylight, when it began to cry with cold and hunger, and it had been brought thus far upon food by hands. I had bestowed a mother's care upon it, but had no chance to prepare it any food since the day previous. As soon as we were permitted to rise, I asked the Indians for some flour, with which to make the babe something to eat. They said, "Yes, it shall have something to eat." A smile accompanied the reply, and a tall, muscular Indian came to me, and taking hold of it, swung it by its arms and threw it up as high as he could, and let it fall upon the ground at his feet. This barbarous act having been repeated 3 times, its sufferings were at an end. The reader will observe that as yet we had eaten nothing since an early breakfast the day before we were taken. As to myself, I felt that I could contain little more of any kind. My heart appeared swollen to an unnatural size within me, and it did not appear to me as though I should ever want food again. The moanings of my dear children for bread and water would have induced me, had it been possible, to have torn my flesh from my bones to appease their hunger, and freely could I have spared the fountain of my heart, which served to protract a miserable existence, to quench their thirst. The mules were now saddled, and a string having been tied round the neck of the babe, it was hung to the horn of a saddle. They then told me to get on it, supposing me to be the mother of the child, but this I refused to do. Its mother was then ordered to get on, but she also refused. They then showed their lances, and threatened to kill us if we did not comply, but still we refused. One of them, who spoke Spanish, approaching the mule, threw the child from the saddle, and told us to get on, when we complied. My little Joseph, the youngest, cried so incessantly that, with all their savage cruelty, it seemed impossible to keep him from me, and they placed him behind me, while John, the eldest, rode behind one of the Indians. We knew not whither we were going, nor the object of our captors. We had supposed that all of our friends had been killed the day before. Judge of our surprise, then, when, after some 300 or 400 yards' travel, we saw Mr. Harris and a young German standing before us. Both of them had been wounded the day previous, and were supposed left dead upon the ground. They were surrounded by a party of Indians who had brought them in, and who had deferred killing them till, with savage cruelty, they could torture us with the sight. Mr. H. had a handkerchief bound about his head. As we rode up, he cast an agonizing look at his dear wife and myself, but he uttered not a word. As soon as the company came to a halt, they were very particular that we should look on while they shot them both dead upon the spot. After this dreadful scene had been completed, we commenced our march. We had proceeded but a short distance before the mule I was mounted on took fright and ran away, throwing me and my child upon the ground, and continued to run until it had disengaged itself from the saddle. A merciful providence preserved me from harm, but my little Joseph was badly bruised on one of his shoulders. They commanded me to pick up the saddle, and to catch the mule and replace it upon its back. I carried the burden for some time, and made fruitless efforts to catch the animal, but in vain. At length, when I was near fainting beneath my load, one of the Indians came with a rope and caught him for me, and as I knew not how to put the saddle on, he did it for me. We traveled the rest of the day in the open prairie, the men being engaged in catching wild horses to eat. We stopped before night and encamped in a thicket. A short time after we had got settled for the night, a number of the Indians came in and brought the rest of the things from our encampment. Among them was the meat and other provisions we were cooking for our dinner at the time they came upon us, which they devoured before our eyes, without permitting us or my children to take a morsel. When the men came in, I asked them what they had done with the body of the child. One of them replied with a laugh that he had hung it on a tree. The other said no, they had tied a stone to it and sunk it in the water. My dear babes were constantly crying for bread and drink, and not a morsel could I get permission to give them, nor could the inhuman wretches be prevailed on to give them either themselves. Late in the evening they brought me a little water, but the quantity was so small that I gave the whole of it to my famishing babes, and they drank it in a moment, though I was nearly dying with thirst. But what will not a mother sacrifice for the pledges of her love? Having bound us on the previous night, the savages retired to rest. Poor Mrs. H. suffered extremely with her breasts. Before our captivity, her husband and myself were able to bestow much attention upon her, but he was now no more, and it was equally out of my power to assist her. Strange as it may appear, throughout the whole of the dreadful tragedy up to the moment of which I write, I had not been able to shed a tear. It seemed that my heart only beat within me to sustain a sensation of anguish, too great for utterance by groans or tears, and that but for the special interposition of an invisible almighty power, the very agony of my soul would have proved to be the angel of my deliverance. But this night, as I pondered upon the fate of my dear husband and children, and my own hopeless condition, and felt the iron hand of disappointment with its withering grasp upon my blasted hopes, at the moment I seemed sinking, if possible, still deeper in despair. The flood seemed to break, and a torrent of tears came to my relief. Yes, though bound hand and foot, so that I could not wipe the scalding drops from my face, the discharge drew from the swelling fountains at my heart, and I poured it upon the ground. And still the ebbing tide of thought flows back, and marks how vain are sublunary things. Oft do I call to mind the dear delights that fluttered round my youthful heart, and promised to fill my cup of life with joys perennial. But soon the flowers that shed enchanted fragrance in the rays of a perihelion sun fell in the ground of disappointments, nor could the floods of sorrow which I shed recall to life the withered leaves. I should have stated before that the Indians, on their return from our camp, had taken the clothing from the bodies of our friends, and also their scalps, which they had painted and set in hoops. The next morning they visited us early and untied our limbs, so as to permit us to rise, which after some difficulty we did. We had heard the noise of the fife and drum for some time before we arose, but could not imagine the cause. We soon, however, learned it. In the midst of the encampment stood a large tree, the bark of which they had stripped off for some distance up, and upon the body of it had painted in a rude manner the figure of myself with Mrs. Harris's babe in my arms. They had also painted her with a hand of each of my children in hers, they standing one on each side of her. It seems they thought that her babe was mine, and that my children were hers. They had designated our bonnets and dresses with the figures on them very strikingly. The men then formed a circle around the tree, each man holding a stick in his hand, with a string tied to the end of it in the form of a whip, to the end of which was fastened one of the scalps. Next to this man stood another holding only a stick, and such was the order of the whole circle. We were then placed in order along with them, and sticks put in our hands. Thus formed, they commenced their music and dancing. This exercise having continued for some time, at a signal given by the chief, they ceased, when those who held the scalps would lower them, and those who held the sticks would beat them. In this we were compelled to join them, but with what kind of feelings the reader may judge, if he can. This scene continued at short intervals for about 2 hours. We remained in this place during the day, while a number of the men went in search of our oxen. They brought in 2 out of 6. Mrs. Harris and myself were employed by the command of our captors in cutting and making our clothes to suit the convenience of the savages. Our dresses were open so that they could wear them, and among them were some that had belonged to my dear mother, which I had preserved as precious mementos. This evening we tasted meat for the first time since our captivity. All we had obtained of food kind hitherto since the morning of the 3rd day past was a small blackberry, a few of which we could gather now and then from the bushes, but at this time keen hunger had subjected us to a willingness to partake of the horse meat which they had killed the day before. But by no means could my dear children be induced to taste it, till they saw me do so. The same evening I begged and obtained leave to pay some attention to Mrs. Harris's breasts. I found they had broken and were in a wretched condition. I dressed them as well as I could with the leaves of the prickly pear, and they soon began to mend. At night we were tied as usual and laid upon the ground. My dear little children were continually distressing me with their artless cries for their father, and for bread. And to quiet them I would tell them that I hoped that we should come to some house tomorrow, where I could get them some bread. But at length they became discouraged and said, "You keep telling us about tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes here." No pen can adequately describe the keen anguish of which a mother's heart is capable, but hitherto the Lord hath helped me. He alone hath seen my affliction, and he alone thus far hath sustained me. The next day we traveled in the same order as before, only they took my little Joseph from me, and placed him behind one of their boys by the name of Soto. The dear little creature suffered much from the bruise on his shoulder, caused by his fall from the mule the morning after we were taken, and I was not permitted to do anything for him, nor even to speak to him a consoling word. In addition to his hurt, he was entirely naked, and frequently, while his skin was burned to a blister, and the boy behind whom he rode so cross that he would not permit him to hold on by him, the little sufferer would watch an opportunity to steal a glance at his almost distracted mother, and tell her of his woes. Every night and morning the little creatures would watch for an opportunity to make their complaints, and their artless entreaties for a morsel of bread were enough to melt any heart but that of a savage. We stopped early in the afternoon, and the Indians killed our oxen. They then set myself and poor Mrs. Harris to prepare a place in which to cook the meats, the manner of which is as follows. They dig a hole in the ground sufficiently large to contain the fire, and then they put sticks in the ground on the margin of the hole, so as to bring the tops of them together and fasten them. The meat is placed on the sticks above, and the fire from the hole beneath cooks it quite well. Poor Mrs. Harris had much trouble to labor with the affliction of her broken breasts, and her difficulties were not a little increased from the circumstance of her being left-handed. The savages would by no means suffer a poor, broken-hearted captive to work with her left hand in the place of the right, and she could do but little with the right. And when in her painful exertions she would use her left hand, they would fall upon her and beat her most unmercifully. There was one Indian woman among them who belonged to the party that claimed Mrs. Harris for their prisoner. She was very small in her person, and I should think not more than 20 years of age. But of all the depraved beings I have seen, and they are not a few, I think she excelled. She was the unceasing tormentor of Mrs. Harris by night and day. I have often seen her take her by the throat and choke her until the poor unresisting creature would turn black in the face and fall as if dead at her feet. And then, to finish the tragedy, her cruel master would jump on her with his feet and stamp her, until I have thought her sufferings were at an end. I could speak Spanish, and there were 2 of the Indians who had been prisoners among the Spaniards in their youth, and they could speak the language. This was a great assistance to me. But my poor fellow prisoner could speak but few words of Spanish, and which to her was a fruitful source of affliction. They had not the patience to talk to her through interpreters, and blows instead of words were plentifully dealt out to her as the organ of their communications. But for the affliction I endured on the account of my children, Mrs. Harris's sufferings were greater than mine. We finally succeeded in accomplishing our task, and were suffered to partake of some of our own beef. This was the second time either of us or my children had tasted meat since we were taken, and as yet we had no salt with it. Until the afternoon of the 2nd day after this, nothing out of the ordinary course occurred. at which time we came to a stream of water and encamped. We were now, as near as I could learn, about the distance of 25 or 30 miles from Matamoros, a seaport town on the Spanish coast. As we approached the stream, some of the Indians in front had crossed it, and as I rode up I saw some Americans on the other side. As the Indians approached them, I saw one of the Americans stretch out his hand, and heard him say, "Stand back! Stand back! It is best for you to stand back." The trees stood so thick together that I could not see what followed, but the report of guns told me, in language which I too well understood, that the work of death was commenced. I could not learn that the Americans had their arms at command at the time. They appeared to have been encamped there for some time, and from what I could learn they made great exertions to avert the impending storm. But ill-fated men, their doom was fixed, and in a few short minutes all their hopes and fears were hushed into the silence of death. Some of our men returned from the other side of the stream, and brought with them an arm of a man, which from its appearance must have been dead a considerable time, as it was black, and much diminished in size. The Indians said it was Tino, American, and quite likely they knew the secret of his death. About this time some more of the Indians returned, and brought with them a Spanish gentleman, a prisoner, into the camp. He was a very small, delicate-looking man. He was brought in upon his own horse, and divested of all his clothing, but just enough to screen his nakedness. They ordered him to be seated on the ground, which command, with an imploring look, he tremblingly obeyed. Upon which his cruel captors began with satanic hypocrisy to profess the utmost friendship for him, telling him he should not be hurt. Their object was thereby to extort from him a knowledge of his place of abode, the number of his family, and the condition of their surrounding country. The captain of the band, into whose hands we had fallen, then ordered his clothes to be given him, and asked him if he knew us, Mrs. Harris and myself. He said he did not, but said we were Americans. The Indian chief told him that we were, and that they were friends to the Spaniards, but not to the Americans, and that they had killed our men but did not intend to kill us until they should see Santa Anna. They wished him to tell them all the news of the country, and which I think he did as far as he could. They then asked him if he had a room in his house to lock us up in, as they wished him to keep us a while until they should go out and look for more Americans. He told them he had not, as his house was small. They then asked if he could supply them with some bread. He told them he could not. They then broke up the encampment and started for his house. But it seemed that the distance was farther than they had supposed, and they halted a little short of it, and encamped for the night. The poor little Spaniard entreated them to let him go home to his wife and children, but no, his fate was sealed. He had seen the dear objects of his deep and keenest solicitude for the last time. That night, as he lay down, they shot him with an arrow, which sent his anxious soul to another world. At the moment when I heard the Indians inquire of the Spaniard for a room to lock us in, a gleam of hope flashed across my mind, that possibly such a measure might prove the means of our deliverance. But how soon did the illusion vanish? The Indians had taken the clothes, horses, and equipage of the Americans killed at the stream. From what I could learn, I judged that these ill-fated men were a fragment of some army that had fled before the merciless Santa Anna. The number of them, I think, was 5 or more, but could not learn exactly. We started early in the morning and soon reached the pleasant little dwelling of the poor Spaniard. The house was so situated that I am apprehensive that the poor little mother with her babes knew nothing of our approach until the ministers of death had surrounded it, upon which the savages rushed into the house, and I saw the fatal arrow as it received its commission to take her life. I saw her fall, and they dragged the beautiful form out at the door, reeking in blood. They then returned and stilled the cries of her sweet little babes in the silence of death. The eldest appeared between 2 and 3 years old, and the other at the breast. These people appeared to have been above the ordinary class. The man was genteelly dressed, and his wife the same. She appeared to have been making her husband some shirts of very fine linen. She had made 2 and was at work on the 3rd. There was a large quantity of the same kind of goods found in the house. After plundering the premises of everything they could turn to their advantage, and destroying what they could not, they left the place. Immediately upon which they made a desperate rush along the margin of the creek. At first I was at a loss to conjecture what could be their object, but I soon learned the dreadful secret. It appeared that the Spaniard had told them of 3 or more of the supposed refugees, and the Indians were striving who should get to the place first to secure the plunder. There were 2 Spaniards and an American. One of them was asleep in a rudely constructed cabin on their arrival. The other 2 were fishing in the creek. The one asleep on the approach of the savages awoke in a great fright, and jumped up and started to run. But his race and his fears were soon ended by a ball directed by the deadly aim of the foe, and he fell to rise no more. The other 2 were shot down as they stood upon the bank. As soon as they had finished their work of blood, they turned out the mules, and here they spent the greatest part of the day. Mrs. Harris and myself were employed in making up the fine linen, taken from the Spaniard's house, into sheets for these wretches to wrap themselves in, and in altering the murdered ladies' dresses for them to wear. While thus mournfully engaged, the savages amused themselves by shooting their arrows into the dead bodies of the men they had just slain, and compelled us to look on while they did so, filling the surrounding forest with their horrid yells of fiendish triumph, and cursing the Americans. So that's it for this episode. We are about halfway through this book written by Sarah Horn back in 1839 to document her captivity with the Comanches, and we will present the end of Sarah's ordeal in the next episode on this channel. One element of the Texas Revolution that is often left out is that the Texians were fighting not only Santa Anna's invading army, but also the hostile Indian tribes such as the Comanches. Although the Comanches sometimes traded with the Spanish settlers, they also attacked them, as in the case of the unfortunate Spaniard and his family that we read about at the end of this episode. The Horn family were settlers in John Charles Beale's colony, which was on the extreme edge of Texas civilization, far west of San Antonio. This was between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers, about 30 miles north of Eagle Pass. The Horn family and others were massacred along the Matamoros Road after they had abandoned the colony. Let us know in the comments what you think of this attack and the capture of Mrs. Horn and her family, and stay tuned to this channel for the conclusion of this story. This channel is called Unworthy History because we present actual history that has been deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. So here on this channel, we keep this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission at this channel, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to our members-only videos, and your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.